The moment that young investor laughed and called the old pier a useless pile of boards, something inside my chest tightened the way it used to before a winter storm rolled in from the Pacific. It was a small laugh, really. Not cruel in the way people sometimes mean to be cruel. Just quick. Casual. The kind of laugh people let slip when they think they're stating an obvious truth. But in that quiet town hall in Astoria, Oregon, it sounded louder than the foghorns that used to echo across the Columbia on winter mornings. I remember the room clearly. The fluorescent lights humming softly above us. Folding chairs arranged in uneven rows across the wooden floor. Rain tapping against the tall windows that faced the harbor. You could hear the wind coming off the river even through the glass, that cold Pacific wind that always smells a little like salt and diesel fuel and wet timber. I was sitting near the back. Not because I wanted to hide. Just because I've always been the kind of man who listens first. Astoria has a way of settling into your bones if you live there long enough. The fog drifts through the streets like it belongs to the town. The gulls circle above the docks even when the sky is gray enough to swallow the sun. And the boats, well, the boats rock slowly against their ropes like they're breathing. Back when I was younger, the harbor was different. Not prettier. But fuller. Fishing boats used to line the docks before sunrise. Small boats mostly. Men who knew each other by name and by the sound of each other's engines. You could stand on the pier at 5 in the morning and hear the low rumble of diesel motors warming up in the dark. That pier they were talking about tearing down stretched straight out from the shoreline like an old finger pointing into the river. Weathered boards. Thick wooden posts darkened by decades of tide and rain. It wasn't much to look at if you didn't know what it had carried. But I knew. Because for nearly 30 years, I stepped onto those boards before sunrise with a thermos of black coffee and a pair of cold hands. No one in that room knew that. The meeting had been organized by the city council. A few developers had come up from Portland. Some young planners with laptops and rolled-up blueprints. They had big glossy drawings spread across a table near the front. A new marina. Floating docks. Glass-front restaurants. Boutique shops facing the river. One of the planners was speaking when I walked in. He had that smooth voice people learned somewhere in college. The kind that moves from slide to slide like everything has already been decided. Revitalizing the waterfront, he said. Creating opportunities. Modernizing the harbor district. People nodded politely. I sat down quietly in the back row and folded my hands over my cane. Another man stood up next. Younger. Nice jacket. Confident smile. He pointed toward the photograph they had projected onto the wall. It was a picture of the pier. Gray boards. Crooked rail posts. A couple gulls perched along the edge. He tilted his head slightly and chuckled. I mean, look at it, he said. It's basically scrap lumber sticking out into the river. That was when the laugh came. Just quick. And a few people in the room smiled along with him. I didn't move. But I felt something warm and sharp rise behind my ribs. It's a strange thing when the place that carried half your life becomes invisible. The meeting continued. Someone from the safety board mentioned that the pier had structural issues. Another planner explained that the waterfront needed to attract more tourism. There were charts. Economic projections. Words like underutilized infrastructure. I watched their mouths move. Outside the window, I could see the harbor through the rain-streaked glass. A few boats rocking slowly against their lines. Not fishing boats. Tour boats. Whale watching. Sunset cruises. The harbor changes quietly when you're not looking. One year there are nets drying along the docks. A few years later there are souvenir stands. That's just the way of things. I don't blame anyone for that. Progress always arrives wearing clean shoes. Still, Hearing them talk about that pier the way a man might talk about an old broken fence, it felt like listening to someone describe your childhood home as a pile of bricks. Eventually the discussion turned to public comments. A few residents spoke. One woman mentioned that the pier had been there since before she was born. A shop owner said the new marina would bring more visitors. The council members nodded thoughtfully. Then one of the younger planners leaned toward the microphone and said something that made a few people in the room chuckle again. "Well," he said lightly, "whoever built that thing probably never imagined the waterfront could look this much better without it." More quiet laughter. "Not mean. Just easy." That was the moment I felt the heat creep up the back of my neck. Because I knew exactly who built it. Not by name. But by hands. Hands like mine. Men who wore wool caps pulled down over their ears in January. Men whose jackets smelled like fish and diesel and river water. Men who drove pilings into the mud long before the town had brochures for tourists. I could almost see them again in my mind. Heavy boots on wet boards. The sound of hammers striking iron spikes. The river rolling slow and gray beneath them. But those memories lived only inside a few old heads now. The meeting moved along. Rain kept tapping softly on the windows. Somewhere outside a gull cried out over the harbor. Then, toward the end, one of the council members, a kind-looking woman with silver hair, glanced around the room. She cleared her throat. "Before we wrap up," she said gently, "I'm curious if anyone here remembers the early days of that pier. It's been part of the waterfront for a long time." There was a pause. People shifted in their chairs. A few heads turned slightly. But no one spoke. The planners looked down at their notes. The younger residents looked uncertain. And for a moment it seemed like the question might simply drift away into the quiet. That's when I realized they were all waiting for someone who might not be there anymore. I looked down at my hands. They were older now. Skin thin and spotted. The same hands that once pulled wet nets over the side of a small wooden boat while the river wind cut through my jacket like a knife. I could have stayed quiet. It would have been easy. Just another old man sitting in the back row while the future rearranged the shoreline. But something about the way that young man had laughed kept echoing in my ears. Not the laugh itself. The forgetting behind it. So I pushed my hands against the arms of the folding chair and slowly stood up. The room shifted slightly as people turned. I could feel every pair of eyes moving toward me. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Rain tapped softly against the glass. And somewhere out in the harbor a distant foghorn sounded low and long. I cleared my throat. "My name's Walter," I said. My voice sounded older than I expected, but it carried across the room. "I don't know much about marina designs," I continued quietly. "But I do remember one morning out on that pier." The room settled. Even the young investor stopped moving his pen. I rested both hands on the top of my cane. "There was a storm the night before," I said. And when the fog lifted the next morning. The whole river looked like it had been shaken awake. I can still see it if I close my eyes. The Columbia was gray and restless, rolling under a sky the color of cold iron. The wind had finally calmed after screaming all night, but the water still carried that long slow swell storms leave behind, like the river remembering what it just went through. The pier was wet and shining under the early light. You could smell everything that morning: salt from the ocean pushing upriver, diesel from engines warming along the docks, the sharp scent of wet rope and cedar planks soaked through with rain. And fog. There was always fog in Astoria. It hung low over the water, drifting slowly between the boats so that their masts appeared and disappeared like ghosts moving through the harbor. I paused a moment there in the town hall, remembering it. The room was very quiet now. People leaned forward slightly without realizing they were doing it. "That storm came in fast," I said. One of those Pacific ones that doesn't ask permission. By midnight the wind was throwing waves clear over the bow. A few older heads in the room nodded faintly. They knew the kind of storm I meant. I was younger then, I continued. Had a little gillnet boat called the Maribel. Nothing fancy. Just a stubborn engine and a hull that had already seen a few winters. I smiled slightly at that memory. When the weather turned bad, most of us stayed out longer than we should have. Nets were heavy with salmon that week. Hard to leave good fish in the water. A soft murmur of understanding passed through the back row. But by morning, I said, every man out there knew the same thing. We needed to get home. I let the silence sit there for a moment. Then I said quietly, when the fog began to thin, you could start seeing the boats coming back. One by one. Then two at a time. Then more. I could almost hear them again. Engines rumbling low through the mist. The slow slap of water against wooden hulls. Gulls screaming overhead because they always knew when boats were returning with fish. That pier was the first thing we saw through the fog, I said. Not the town. Not the hills. Just that line of dark board stretching out over the water. I shifted my weight slightly on the cane. The storm had pushed half the fleet upriver and scattered the rest toward the mouth. By the time the fog cleared enough to see, boats were coming in from every direction. I looked around the room slowly. There must have been 20 of us. Maybe more. Men who had been fighting wind and water all night. Men whose hands were numb and whose jackets were stiff with salt. Men who had nets full of fish and engines that had worked harder than they should have. And that pier, I said softly, held every single one of us. I could feel the memory settling into the room now. When the first boat tied off, the rest started lining up along the sides. Ropes flying through the air. Boots slipping on wet boards. Someone shouting for a spare cleat. Someone else grabbing a line before it drifted away. I chuckled quietly. Half of us were too tired to talk straight. But we worked anyway. That's what fishermen do. I described how men jumped from boat to pier, grabbing ropes and pulling vessels close enough to tie. How the wood creaked under the weight of wet nets and heavy coolers. How the pier posts groaned slightly as the river current pressed against the boats. But it held, I said. Every line tied. Every boat secured. The rain outside the town hall windows had grown softer now. You could hear it in a steady whisper against the glass. And when the boats were tied, I continued, something else happened. No one interrupted. No one checked their phones or shuffled papers. The men who got there first started helping the ones still coming in. I looked toward the floor for a moment as the memory sharpened. Someone passed a coil of rope down the line. Someone else grabbed a net that weighed more than it should have. Fish sliding across the boards. Water dripping from the mesh. A faint smile touched my mouth. We didn't talk about it much. Just did what needed doing. Because that's how small harbors survive storms. Not alone. Together. I could still hear the sounds from that morning. Wood creaking. Boots thudding against wet planks. The low hum of engines cooling down. And every so often, laughter. Not the kind from earlier in the meeting. The tired kind. The kind that comes after you realize you made it back. The sun finally broke through the fog around mid-morning, I said quietly. And there we all were, boats tied shoulder to shoulder along that old pier. Fish piled high in crates. Men leaning against rail posts. Coffee getting passed around in dented thermoses. And that pier, I repeated, didn't move an inch. I lifted my eyes toward the planners. It carried the weight of every one of us that day. My voice softened. Not just the boats. The room was completely still now. Even the younger developer who had laughed earlier sat frozen with his hands folded on the table. I took a slow breath. I'm not saying the town shouldn't change, I continued calmly. Harbors always do. I looked toward the window where the gray outline of the river could just barely be seen through the rain. Maybe that marina will be beautiful. Maybe the shops will bring people who fall in love with this place. I nodded once. That would be a good thing. Then I rested both hands on the cane again. All I wanted to say, I finished gently, is that the pier you're looking at in those pictures carried a lot more than boards and nails. My voice dropped to almost a whisper. It carried people. For a moment no one said anything. The council members sat quietly. The planners looked down at the photographs again. But they weren't seeing the same picture anymore. I could tell. Because once you imagine 20 fishing boats tied along a pier after a storm, the wood doesn't look like scrap lumber anymore. It looks like something that held lives steady. I lowered myself slowly back into the folding chair. The metal legs creaked against the floor. Someone near the front cleared their throat. Then another voice spoke, soft, uncertain. "Sir, how long did you fish out there?" I looked up. "About 30 years, I said. A few heads turned toward the window again. Toward the river. The meeting continued after that. People discussed safety reports and renovation costs. Someone suggested that maybe part of the pier could be preserved. Another proposed a plaque explaining its history. I didn't argue for anything. My piece had already been said. When the meeting ended, people stood slowly and gathered their papers. The young investor who had laughed earlier approached me near the door. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I didn't realize," he said quietly. I smiled at him. "That's all right," I told him. "Most people don't." He nodded and looked out toward the harbor through the glass doors. I stepped outside into the cold evening air. The rain had nearly stopped. Across the water the fog was beginning to roll back in, just the way it always had. Boats rocked gently against their lines. Ropes creaked against wooden posts. And somewhere far out on the river a foghorn sounded, deep and steady. I stood there for a while listening to it. Not waiting for applause. Not expecting the pier to be saved. Just feeling that quiet satisfaction a man gets when he's finally told the truth of something. Because the older I get, the more I understand a simple thing. The strongest foundations in this world are often the ones people stop noticing. And that's all right. Wood weathers. Harbors change. New generations build their own docks and their own stories. But every now and then, in a quiet room where rain taps softly on the windows, someone remembers. And for a moment, the old pier stands again, steady in the fog, carrying the weight of tired boats and the men who brought them home.